Hi, I'm Michaela, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what I learned about colonialism over this past semester. Um, I read the introduction from the book Speaking My Truth by Sheila Rogers. With the part that I read, she gets the story of a residential school survivor. But one quote from her book is, "Colonialism is not over. Its tentacles reach into the present, and it is the greatest stain on Canada." So I'm just going to talk a little bit about uh, what I feel about that quote, um, what I think about colonialism and its place in the past, and if it's still relevant in today's world and if we're still dealing with it. So I think what's important first is to figure out my understanding of what colonialism is. So from what I've learned from this course, I think that the kind of simplest definition for me on colonialism is um, one culture or a people group, which is the colonizing group. They impose upon another culture and their people, and they either try to exterminate and or assimilate them into the colonizing group's culture. So I know that kind of sounded a little funny, but that's kind of how I think about it, is one group imposing on and trying to either get rid of or kind of absorb the other. Um, that mentality, there has to be some idea of the colonizing group, like, being better in some way, or otherwise there'd be no reason to need to exterminate or assimilate the other group, or they have to be in the way of what the colonizing group wants. Um, so I think, obviously, that Canada has a colonialist past completely. I don't think that there's really a valid argument to disagree with that. We're totally based on people coming from Europe and taking what is here and taking over, whether it's resources as fish in the fish trade first and then the fur trade, and then kind of settling here, taking land, taking resources, where it's a colonialist country. It's been colonized. Um, I think that we are still living with colonialism. I don't think that it is something of the past. I think that there is maybe progress towards what I'll call decolonization, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, but I don't think that we are there yet. One of the biggest things, I think, to me that stands out of still having a colonizing mentality is that idea of the imaginary Indian. It was so prominent early on in, we read an article where that image of the imaginary Indian is used to, they stereotype all Indians as one group, take the desirable trait, match it up with a product or whatever they're trying to kind of sell, and make it more marketable, because they're seen as a novelty, they're seen as disappearing as kind of something of the past, like a fairy tale or whatever, the Indian character. So they use, we have lots of examples where that was used to market tourism, get people to come out on the railway, things like that. But that hasn't stopped. It's still so prominent today, that image of the imaginary Indian. Like, it's everywhere. We still see, I mean, there's cars and things like that, like Pontiac, that we don't even associate, I think, many people with the Indian image, but you see it everywhere. Signs for stores or products that still use Redskins or Indians and things like that. Or especially sports teams, I think, is the big one that we've been talking about recently, because there is a little bit more attention and people speaking out saying this is not right. So yeah, there's the whole cultural appropriation aspect of taking certain aspects that you want um, to achieve a goal of marketing or whatever that is. And I think even in terms of Halloween costumes, and we talked a little bit about this semester with headdresses and that kind of being a fashion trend, and especially at festivals and things like that, music festivals. Um, it's using that image out of context, and it's being done by people, by settlers, and they're taking part of a culture that isn't theirs and using it inappropriately. And that's, I think, that shows a colonizing mentality, because there's something in those settler people that think that it's okay to do that, that they have some right to do that, and they don't. But that's part of the of colonialism. There is that cultural appropriation, taking advantage of the pieces that they can and kind of ignoring what doesn't suit them. The one article that really stuck out a lot to me that we looked at this semester was about playing Indian at summer camps, because I've grown up my whole life at summer camps. That's been a huge part of my life. And this course made me realize I never even knew that was a part of what was going on. It was just so natural to my experience that I didn't even realize. But the idea of having kids play Indian and having teepees and totem poles at camp is another example of cultural appropriation, and kind of building that fantasy of the Indians of the past. And that even takes it to the other level of the dead Indian. It's like they're gone now, we get to play with that image however we want, because the colonizers destroyed them. But that's not true. They're still alive. Like, the culture is still alive. So yeah, that example really made a big impact on me. Another thing was museums. Since taking Indigenous Studies courses, I found myself being more aware when I go to museums. Like, I notice at the Mavericks Museum, at the Glenbow Museum, the kind of the Indigenous perspective signs that are stuck up throughout, but kind of as an afterthought, it looked like to me. And so I did a little bit more questioning into it, and it turns out that they looked like to be an afterthought because they were an afterthought. And we read an article by Gloria Jean Frank called "That's My Dinner" on display, and then we also read about the Museum of Anthropology in BC. And there's definitely been some progress in terms of repatriating artifacts back to the original owners and groups, the original Indigenous groups. But I think there's still that mentality there with the colonizing mentality of collecting those things from another culture to display it as we choose. And that was one of the biggest issues in those articles, was whether or not Aboriginal people were consulted, whether they had a say in how they were presented or represented by these artifacts. And that's really important, because if we don't give that opportunity, and it's not even that we even right there, that's I think a colonialist mentality, because it's not me giving Aboriginal people the opportunity. That is their right to their culture, and they should be teaching me their culture. I shouldn't be telling them how they can teach me their culture. I think that makes sense. Because if I'm doing that, that's with a colonizing mentality. I have control over that and over you. Something I think that's a little bit more modern than what a lot of people think of as early colonialism is the White Paper in 1969. It was proposed by Pierre Trudeau and the Liberal Party. It didn't go through, and I think that a lot of people would see good intentions in it. It used a lot of really good language, like equality, things like that. But basically, the idea behind the paper is there's a problem with Indigenous people, and that problem is that they are Indigenous, and that the only way to fix all the problems of Indigenous people is by taking that title away and taking away any rights or status associated with that. When in reality, I think that's not the problem. The problem is the colonizers. All the problems, like alcoholism, poverty, poor housing on reserves, graduation rates, all of that is a result of colonization. And because those impacts of colonization are so prominent in 1969 and still today, right there, I think, is an example of why colonialism is not over. All of these effects from the past, from confrontations, from residential schools, all of these things are still affecting people today. And so the problem with Indigenous people is not that they're Indigenous. The problem with Indigenous people is that they've been colonized, and therefore that's not a problem with them. That's a problem with the colonizers. And Indigenous people did respond with the red paper saying, no, that's not okay. We deserve to keep our status. And even though things like the Indian Act, which is what legally gave them their status, were racist, still are racist, they wanted to keep those things in place because they were the only things that legally gave them their status as Indigenous Aboriginal Canadians. And so, yeah, that's important that recognition is there. Otherwise, it's just trying to further that kind of assimilation. Like, we take away the status, and therefore gone is the Indigenous culture because everyone is just Canadian. And that is further trying to assimilate, further trying to colonize. I think the residential schooling system is one of the biggest examples that we're just kind of learning more about in modern times. I think as the general population of Canada, it was the biggest push for assimilation by the government and churches to absorb, assimilate, and destroy Aboriginal culture in Canada. We read an article on, it wasn't just that going on in schools, the assimilation and absolute intentional destruction of culture, but there was things like nutritional testing and biomedical research where they were withholding necessary nutrition and health to these children. And then there's so many stories that we read from survivors and heard from Milton Born with a Tooth about the tragedies suffered by residential school survivors. And Milton Born with a Tooth really said something that hit home with me. He talked about how the residential school survivors had all those abuses, but when they came home and they grew up and they became mothers and fathers, they were missing those skills to love, to parent. They were trying to deal with their own terrible past from residential school, and they were dealing with that often in unhealthy ways, like through alcohol and things like that. And that didn't just affect them, that affected how they parented their kids, how those next generations were abused, so then they turned to alcohol and things like that to deal with it. And so, yeah, Milton Born with a Tooth really, that really hit home with me, that that colonialist practice that was put through using residential schools didn't stop with the people that went to residential schools. It affects still today, and there's no way to measure those effects because they're massive. And we looked a little bit at The Apology by Stephen Harper in 2008, and the move for reconciliation, but how that's still so hard for both sides, and how there's so many differing opinions even within Indigenous communities about what that entails and what it means and what people are willing to accept as appropriate reconciliation or an appropriate apology or repayment for all that loss. And that's still affecting people today. So there's no way that we can say that colonialism is not affecting today. And the other part of that quote is that it's the greatest stain on Canada. And I think that's really proving, because like a stain is something that you can try to get out. But it takes a lot to get it out, and sometimes it's impossible. And I think things like the reconciliation about residential schools are really showing that it is taking a lot of money, a lot of time, and it's really very little progress in that actual apology, because it's such a deep stain, such a deep wound from colonization. And something else that's kind of showing that is land claims that have been going on for years now, but are still very active today. Tons of groups are making land claims, and it goes so far back to like the Royal Proclamation in 1763, which said that Indigenous people had title to land unless it was ceded through treaty. So in places like BC, where there was never treaty signed, that's still huge. Things like the Calder case acknowledged that those treaties had never been signed. They still had title to that land, but there's been so much colonization that's really hard now. You have to deal with all of the settlers in that, and it's just really complicated, right? And there was, through treaties and stuff, that's how we got the creation of reserves, and that's really tricky too, because not only did it really shrink the area massively, the traditional territory where that Aboriginal people occupied shrunk down to this little tiny static area that they had to stay in, and then sometimes it wasn't even within their traditional territory to begin with, and then like through the military cutting down the size of reserves to use for training and things like that, and sometimes that land got returned, and a lot of time it didn't. And then we kind of accidentally looked at it in class, but things like the Peasant Farming Act, which was intentional acts and legal restrictions placed on Indigenous people by the government that restricted their ability to farm by restricting the tools they could use, things like that. And then they came in and said, you're not using this land effectively, so we're chopping it down more. So there's this constant, and we're still dealing with this today with land claims, with settlers saying, no, this land belongs to us, Indigenous people saying, well, no, this land is ours, it's sacred, or we have original title to it, things like that. So it's really complicated, and that's an ongoing issue of colonialism. It's not over, it's not dealt with. And there are numerous processes. We look at how Indigenous groups go through negotiation, litigation, create political organizations. When all those things don't work, they go to nonviolent confrontations, building blockades and things like that. And it has gotten so far escalated in numerous cases that they've actually resorted to violent confrontations, like those at Oka and at Ipperwash, where those situations were dealt with in a completely maybe unfair way, like with Oka, with bringing in what started out as a peaceful blockade, bringing in the military, the police force, heavy weaponry to deal with these things, or Ipperwash, where Dudley George was killed. He was an unarmed protester, and all these cases were over land, and the inquiry into that after showed all of those people, they were unarmed and everything, but the way that the government dealt with it was violence in response. So, and I mean, that just furthers to the pain when people like Dudley George are killed. Now that creates, one more stain, like one more point of anger on the side of Indigenous people towards the way they've been treated by these colonists, and that colonialism, and that's not that long ago. That's still happening. And then we looked at the criminal treatment. We talked about the crazy amount of Aboriginal people in prisons compared to any other population. And, it's a little bit unclear why. Is that because they are committing more crimes, or is that because of a racist system as a result of colonialism? And, it seems to be a lot of evidence that that's probably what it is. We looked at cases like Helen Betty Osborne and Pamela George, women who were murdered because they were Indigenous. In the case of Pamela George, one of the killers was quoted saying she deserved it, she was Indian. So the reason they were targeted was because they were Indian. And then the reason their cases took so long was because they were Indigenous. And, in the case of Helen Betty Osborne, there's probably 3 men involved, originally 1 accused and charged. So there's a lot of discrepancy between Indigenous people in the legal system and settlers. And then even just dealing with kind of those stereotypes of the drunk Indian, which I feel like in Calgary, it's a stereotype I really grew up with. And we looked at the idea of starlight tours and people like Frank Paul, who died because the justice system, as even the lowest level of an officer picking up a drunk man, was not willing, because they were Indigenous, was not willing to go to the appropriate, like even the standard ways of dealing with the situation because they were Indigenous. And that is definitely a result of colonialism and stereotypes of which culture and what they are like, and how they should be dealt with. So I think all of this kind of leads to, we talk about colonization and now decolonization, and how are we moving towards that? And I think settlers and Indigenous people have very different ideas of what decolonization looks like. I think things like the white paper demonstrate that to many settlers, decolonization looks like equality. It looks like the removal of any special status or rights. Everyone is equal. I think to Indigenous people, decolonization looks like recognition of who they are and their ties to the land that they are on, and recognition of what they have gone through because of colonialism, and some way of dealing with that, because that's not fair. There's no equality. There's no way that just by stripping them of any status that makes equality, because of colonialism they have been pushed so far down in terms of opportunity that just by stripping them of status, they won't be moved up any higher. So there are necessary steps that need to be taken to actually put people on the same level, and that is a result of colonialism. And we read an article about unsettling the settler within, and I think that's really what it takes on the part of settlers, is to look at what are we responsible for as settlers in terms of our government and their past and current and future actions, and in terms of shifting our own mentality towards colonialism and our place in it all. I think that we have made progress towards decolonization in some ways. I think especially through collaboration. Colonialism was a process that involved numerous, but if we're looking at settler and Indigenous cultures. And so decolonization needs to involve those two cultures. I think that really good examples of progress towards decolonization are Nunavut and the Nisga'a Agreement. These are both agreements where Indigenous people were given recognition to their ties to their traditional land. They were given land and resource rights. They were given some form of self-government. I mean, it's still not necessarily complete and total self-determination because they're still subject to provincial and federal governments. None of it not provincial, but, there's still that interaction. But even having that self-government makes a huge difference. And, things like in the Nishka Agreement, artifact repatriation, that goes back to the museums and what I was talking about there. And then economic self-sufficiency. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, which was a response to the Oka crisis, it talked about things like self-identity through self-government, economic self-sufficiency, healing. These were necessary recommendations, and I think that we are seeing a little bit of progress towards that. I think we have a huge way to go, and I think colonialism definitely, as the original quote is, its tentacles reach into the present, and it is still active and has a huge effect today, and it is a stain, and there's a lot of work to get it out, and I don't know if we can ever really get it removed. But I think that progress can be made, and I think that there are roadblocks still, but through collaboration, I think is the way that we will reach. We'll move past that colonialism, and I hope that someday we will be able to look at a quote like this and say colonialism is over. I don't know when that will be, but I think that through collaboration, that's what it's going to take. Thanks for listening.